Nobody? Don't go through that door. Brian.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, maybe in the interest of also getting our plenary speakers to interact too, whether Lucy might like to respond to Steve, thinking about Steve's disruption perhaps as actually being, at least potentially, a process of actually forcing open spaces of possibility rather than only holding open spaces of possibility. I think you get my point, Lucy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really nice observation, and I greatly applaud Steve, the exemplary role model that Steve is providing for us, and the tremendous courage it takes to make trouble in the way that he did in the security line at the airport. And I mean, I guess I see a link between what we've each talked about as different, maybe different forms of resistance or different forms of disruption, where mine is a little bit less unruly, and I probably should, take some lessons from Steve insofar as mine is just trying to sort of unpack the retrograde histories of a lot of these cutting-edge technologies. But I think I hope they're complementary.
Thanks, Brian. That's a very nice question. Lucy's right. It does take an awful lot of stupidity to do this. to do this. I was going to make the point also that the interactions with the security clerks are, of course, my immediate post-interaction recollections. I had to write them down. There was no question of using any recording device, because those objects are thoroughly implicated with terror in that context. I did have a beautiful photograph of Dan being searched at security clearance in one airport, but they went ballistic and forced me to delete the photograph and so on. Now, I don't know, these disruptions, as you'll know, are not motivated, well, I don't know. I was going to say they're not motivated to try and bring about change, that wasn't the primary motive. And it's not at all clear to me that they are necessarily very successful ways of bringing about change. But I suppose they do at least emphasise our reliance upon, our unthinking reliance on some of these definitions and categories.
Hello, Maureen McNeil, also from Lancaster. I wondered if each of the speakers could reflect a little bit about the trope of making trouble. And I think that was quite interesting to think about in relation to what STS should or shouldn't do, as well as the relationship between the technologies you were discussing and the actors most immediately involved.
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. Making trouble, in what sense and in what context? I never can imagine that the thing that Steve has been doing, that I could do this with telemonitoring technologies. Now, it's so consequential there what's happening that you can't take the role of disrupting the system yourself as a social scientist. So that tells something about how, what also the limits of this technology, of this kind of method are. But I think more in a way, how I would like to approach it is in this context of health, that you can look at trouble in the sense of how there are contestations in specific use situations. So if the, like what Lucy also beautifully showing with the robotic, that also is happening in the context of a telemonitoring situation. So I think it's a nice site or location also to look at, you know, kind of event that's happening, that's where trouble is. So I think that's a rich concept to use.
Well, I'd actually like to ask Maureen, because she's obviously thinking of something here, and she's trying to get us to, to say what you think about that question.
No, you're making trouble. No, I'm just very struck by the different consequences for STS scholars in different contexts in making trouble. And also, I was very struck, especially in Steve's example, about the absolute reluctance to make trouble in relation to these new forms of governance, which, you know, I thought was a really powerful part of the stories, especially around the security issues. So I was curious about that.
It's not, of course, just STSs who make trouble. I mean, the whole spoof website was a form of quite interesting resistance, satire, mimicry, which I think is which is important, and the people were clearly doing themselves without any help from STSs. The security cues and security questions, I think are quite interesting. As you noted, that people were very compliant the whole time, and one falls to wondering what kind of security check would have people saying, right, that's enough, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And the best I could come up with was the idea of exploding buttons. So if buttons became an object of terror, for a short time there would be a lot of protests, it seems to me, but then of course the burgeoning market in buttonless garments, which would flow from them.
Just have a comment on that. I think everybody knows, but the place you're investigating there is one of the few places in the world where telling a joke is explicitly outlawed. And there are people who've gotten themselves in bad trouble telling jokes at the entry point of the airport when the security is available. And in a way, I mean, I've thought about this in a long time in terms of the old ethnomethodology disruption exercises, that they resemble practical jokes in a very close way. And you were on, you know, we might have to bail you out with 4S money if you keep up with this practice, because it's verging very closely on a joke at the point of entry of institutionalized seriousness. I have to answer that. Okay, let's get some questions.
I think, Steve, you would appreciate my problem of having to buy and then discard corkscrews over many trips until I was given a Teflon corkscrew, which remains invisible to all of the current detecting devices in airports.
See, something really useful has come out of this session.
Hi, really provocative papers. During some recent moments of sort of institutions of the law, it has become really clear to me that rather being imagined as outside and unknowing, there's a moment where there's a statement, you know that. And I was at the airport, and all of a sudden this series of this family is brought aside. And they say to them, they have 10 snow globes in New Orleans. And they say to them, you know that snow globes are not allowed through security. And I was, snow globes? Snow globes. Oh God, I'm sorry. A plastic bauble the size of a baseball with water and glitter inside in a scene of a city.
That's not mundane technology.
So, but what really, it's a technology. What really interests me, because also pulled aside in an area that I didn't know, I was told, you know that the speed limit here is whatever, whatever. And so I'm wondering about the ways that we're brought in by this notion of knowing. And for Nellie too, I'm wondering how the sort of, you know, kind of the teledistant user is brought into certain practices by assumptions of our relationship to the law of technologies.
Thanks. It sounds fairly sort of Foucauldian in your inflection.
I'm making too much there.
All right, a bit Foucauldian. I think there's a bit of mileage in this, and certainly the appropriate subject position responsible driver is somebody who is expected to know a lot of things, including, to our surprise, to know which websites to consult to find out which speed cameras are operating. So quite frequently we were told that somebody got speeding because they were stupid enough not to check the website before they set out on their journey. So it's a very interesting shift of accountability. Responsibility, the driver is now responsible for finding out when they're going to get caught. And they've only themselves to blame if they do get caught.
Okay. When I read the call for this conference, at least the way I read it.
We have an answer to this last question.
I thought there was a question raised for me as well, but I can leave it to the floor. No? Okay. Well, on the side of patients in these type of systems, of course, there are a lot of assumptions about their knowledge, what they are supposed to know or to do. And to give you one practical example of that, these assumptions, you know, are just over the top in terms of if you have a system that's supposed to be used to detect irregularities of your heart system, of your heartbeat, then it's assumed that the patients know when it is very serious moment to make a registration. Well, that was the biggest problem that the patients had. So the system failed in that sense that they didn't have this kind of assured knowledge. So of course, all these kind of different devices embody specific assumptions about knowledge on the part of patients that are not necessarily there. So we can talk about anti-programs, and the consequences of these are, of course, that things can go seriously wrong. So it's also there, not trouble, but in a different sense.
Thank you. In the introduction of the call for papers for this conference, I think the organizers tried to trace a certain movement of STS, that STS was increasingly being applicable and made relevant or useful to various contexts of application, almost as if STS had become some sort of tool, you could argue. But it seems to me that when I'm listening to your presentations, you're in a sense, all of you resisting a bit this move towards applicability or making yourself useful in various ways. Perhaps I'm caricaturing a bit what the different parties to this potential conflict say, but I would like to hear your responses to that.
I guess a very personal response in terms of my own relationship to the relevance issue and the things that I spoke about, and particularly the way that I spoke about being co-opted as relevant by a group in a way that I hadn't anticipated, and being found to not make trouble for them at all, which was really quite disconcerting. Actually, that research was funded through a claim to relevance quite elsewhere, which looking at the way that, particularly in the UK, there's been a lot of funding towards e-science recently, and there's this move towards
funding e-science. E-science will be better science, bigger science, more collaborative science, more relevant science, and so on and so on. And my claim was at the time that the study of systematists was going to be of relevance in troubling that domain, so being funded under that banner of relevance, I spent a lot of time during the research rendering myself relevant to troubling that e-science domain, and not really maybe attending to what I was doing to my systematists domain. So to backtrack to the general point, STS and relevance, yes, well, the experience was certainly one of needing to render narratives and accounts of relevance, and particularly in funding circles, but that experience by no means encompassing what then ensues in terms of the research as it evolves and enters various spheres. So, very personal experience of STS needing to be relevant, but that being a very situated and shifting kind of thing. Okay.
In terms of this particular study, it certainly wasn't framed as being or needing to be potentially relevant or useful to recycling managers or traffic regulation organisations or security people. There is potential there because it's quite clear that a lot of those systems depend on rather naive psychologies of individuals, and they don't take into account the fact that all the people involved and their objects are in various kinds of accountability relation. So the tendency seems to be to treat people who don't behave as deviants. So one could get involved in helping the forces of regulation to do their work better. I just chose not to do so. But I think the general characterisation of STS is right. And there's a lot of other work been going on which looks precisely at this question: in what sense and for what purpose and how could STS be useful, and to whom, and what happens when you migrate STS ideas beyond academia and so on. So that is definitely going on.
Yeah, I think for type of, kind of relevancy, of course. You can't talk about this in general terms. I think it's reflecting on the project I'm trying to do now. It's more in terms of, providing different, critical interventions in a dominant discourse. That's if you, get feedback and you present your papers in different audiences than STS audiences. Particularly among, for example, the case of, I presented here, healthcare workers whose position is at risk because there is this all of a sudden a new talent nurses kind of profession. They really appreciated that their work becomes visible. So it's kind of very modest kind of a way of providing a language or giving visibility to certain kinds of practices and showing the consequences of, if telemonitoring technologies would become the dominant way of how we care for people. So that's what I represent.
I thought we'd run out of time. I guess, I feel that I've recently been liberated from 2 decades under the tyranny of having to be useful. And so I welcome the opportunity to be at Lancaster, where I can be around a bunch of people who can celebrate not being useful. More seriously, of course, the question is useful for whom, and I think we have to pay very close attention to the politics of usefulness and navigate our way through those politics and think about with whom we want to affiliate and what that means in terms of the relevance of our work for what and to whom. And there is no, the dominant definition of usefulness is implicitly usefulness to those who have the purse strings, but we could broaden the sense of what it might mean to be useful, and I think that's certainly worth doing.
Well, let's thank our speakers. Two things. One is, again, avoid those doors. And don't training exercises. And also, there's a business meeting in a half hour for those of you who would like to attend. We certainly encourage you to do so. That's for the 4S.